In the quiet hollows of Robertson County, Tennessee, nestled deep in the thick, untouched woods, a sinister legend had been whispered for generations. It was a tale so chilling, so disturbing, that even the bravest of souls feared to venture too close to the Bell family homestead after dusk. It was the haunting of the Bell Witch, a dark presence that had tormented the Bell family in the early 19th century, and which, to this day, lingers in the very air of that cursed land. The Bell family, John, his wife, Lucy, and their children, moved to the banks of the Red River in the early 1800s, seeking peace, a fresh start, and the promise of land to call their own. The farm was modest, but it was theirs. It was a place of hard labor, quiet nights under the stars, and the constant hum of nature's rhythms. But soon, the tranquility they sought would unravel, and the peaceful woods would turn against them. It began subtly. Strange noises would drift through the house in the dead of night. Tapping, scratching, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving across the wooden floors when no one was there. At first, John Bell and his family thought it was the wind, or perhaps an animal that had found its way into the walls. But when the noises grew louder, more insistent, and impossible to ignore, they could no longer dismiss it as the work of nature. It wasn't long before the family began to hear voices. Soft whispers, faint at first, almost inaudible, but with a cruel edge that sent shivers down their spines. The words, though often unclear, seemed to be directed at them, accusing them of sins they did not understand. Lucy Bell, the mother, would often sit alone in the kitchen, hearing a voice whispering her name, calling her in a voice both comforting and mocking. "Lucy! Lucy!" The voice grew stronger as the days passed, echoing in the dark corners of the house. John Bell, a stout and proud man, attempted to put an end to the disturbances by scolding the air, but it only escalated. The spirit, or whatever it was, seemed to grow bolder with each passing night. It began to mimic the voices of the family members, at first in gentle tones, but soon it became something much more sinister. One evening, as the family gathered around the hearth, a loud bang echoed through the house. The door rattled violently, and the windows shook as if some unseen hand was trying to tear the walls apart. Lucy Bell screamed, clutching her children close to her. John Bell rushed to the door, but when he opened it, the silence that greeted him was almost worse than the chaos. The air outside was still, the moon full and bright, and not a trace of the malevolent force that had just ravaged their home. That night, as John lay in bed, a cold, oppressive weight settled on his chest. It was as if the very air around him had thickened, making it difficult to breathe. He could feel eyes watching him, but when he looked around, there was nothing. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, twisting and writhing like living things. In the darkness, a voice hissed in his ear, "Leave or die." The voice was no longer the soft whisper it had once been, but a guttural growl filled with venom. John's heart raced as he tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. He felt the pressure on his chest increase, as if invisible hands were squeezing the life out of him. He managed to break free from the invisible grip, gasping for air, but the terror had already settled deep within his soul. The hauntings didn't stop. They only grew worse. The Bell children were the next to suffer. Betsy Bell, John and Lucy's young daughter, was the first to feel the full wrath of the spirit. At first, it seemed as though the unseen force was playing tricks on her, pulling her hair, pinching her arms, and tripping her as she walked. But soon it escalated. One night, Betsy was found thrashing violently in her bed, her limbs twisted in unnatural angles, as though some unseen force was holding her down. Her screams echoed through the house, a desperate cry for help that was never answered. The family would hear her cries at all hours of the day and night, though no one was ever near her. Her torment was relentless. One evening, as she sat at the table, a chair beneath her suddenly flew across the room, smashing against the wall with a deafening crack. It was as if an invisible hand had hurled it with great force. The family watched in horror, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. As the days wore on, the Bell family became increasingly isolated. The neighboring settlers, once friendly and eager to trade, began to avoid the Bell farm. They had heard the stories, the terrifying accounts of strange noises, of a young girl who had been possessed by an unseen force, of a family slowly being driven mad by something they could not see, but only feel. It wasn't long before word spread across the region, and visitors from all over Tennessee came to witness the strange happenings for themselves. Some came out of curiosity, others out of fear. There were those who believed it was the work of witches or dark magic, and a handful of men even came to try and exorcise the spirit. But every attempt to rid the Bell family of the malevolent force only seemed to make it stronger. The Bell Witch, as the spirit came to be known, reveled in the terror it caused. It mocked the family, repeating their words back to them with cruel precision. The haunting continued unabated for years, and with it, the Bell family grew weaker. John Bell, once a sturdy and proud man, began to waste away, his health deteriorating rapidly. His once robust frame became gaunt, his face drawn and pale, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. John Bell would wake in the night, his limbs stiff and unresponsive, as if the very life was being drained from him. The voice of the Bell, which would taunt him in those hours, whispering of his impending death. "You will die, old man," it would hiss. Soon, very soon. But it was the death of John Bell that would mark the climax of the haunting. On December 20th, 1820, John Bell was found dead in his bed. His body was cold, and there were no signs of illness or injury. Nothing that could explain his sudden, unexplained death. The family was left to wonder if the Bell, which had finally claimed the life it had promised. The room where John had passed was cold, the air thick with an unnatural chill. Even the scent of decay seemed to hang in the air, though John's body had been perfectly preserved. As the years passed, the Bell, which continued to torment the family, but the stories began to fade into legend. The once bustling farm fell into ruin, abandoned by those too frightened to remain. But whispers of the Bell, which persisted. People still report hearing strange noises in the woods near the Bell family homestead. Visitors to the site claim to feel an oppressive force watching them, an invisible weight that makes the air heavy and difficult to breathe. Some say they hear faint whispers in the trees. Others report seeing shadowy figures flitting through the woods at night. Some of the most chilling accounts come from those who have dared to visit the Bell Witch Cave, a site believed to be the epicenter of the hauntings. Those who enter the cave speak of an overwhelming sense of dread, of feeling watched by something ancient and malevolent. One visitor reported that as they stepped deeper into the cave, they felt a cold hand brush against their neck, and a voice, low and guttural, whispered in their ear, "Get out, before it's too late." No one has ever been able to explain the Bell Witch, and some say that the spirit of the Bell Witch still haunts the land, waiting for its next victim. It is said that John Bell's soul remains trapped in the grip of the witch, a captive in the very place he died, forever cursed by the presence that claimed his life. The Bell Witch is not just a ghost or a spirit. It is something older, something far darker than most can comprehend. It feeds on fear, thrives on torment, and holds the power to destroy anyone foolish enough to enter its domain. It is a presence that lingers, waiting to strike. And the cursed land of the Bell family is still haunted by its whispers, its shadows, and its thirst for souls. The Amityville Horror, a terrifying legacy. It was the kind of house that made you feel uneasy the moment you laid eyes on it. The large, dark structure loomed against the backdrop of the sleepy suburban neighborhood in Amityville, New York, with its Gothic windows that seemed to stare back at you. Even the sun, high in the sky on the warm autumn day, couldn't quite banish the oppressive atmosphere around 112 Ocean Avenue. But what truly made the house terrifying was the chilling legacy it carried. The Lutz family, George, Kathy, and their 3 children, had no idea what they were getting into when they moved into the house in December of 1975. On the surface, it seemed like the perfect home, a spacious, beautiful house that would provide their family with everything they needed. A fresh start, but lurking beneath its pristine exterior was something far darker, something more sinister. The first sign that something was wrong came almost immediately. As the family walked through the front door, the air inside felt unnaturally cold, despite the fireplace crackling to life in the living room. It was a biting cold that seemed to sink into their very bones, even as they unpacked their belongings. Kathy, always the more optimistic of the two, dismissed it as nothing more than the house settling. But George, ever the skeptic, felt a gnawing sense of unease that he couldn't shake. He brushed it off, telling himself it was simply the stress of the move, but deep down, he couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. At night, things grew worse. It began with strange sounds, low, guttural growls, as if something or someone was lurking just out of sight. They could hear the unmistakable creak of the stairs, the sounds of doors opening and closing, and even the faint echo of footsteps padding down the hall when they knew no one else was awake. The dog, Harry, whom the family had brought with them, refused to go anywhere near the basement and would whine, his eyes wide with terror, whenever anyone suggested going down there. George tried to stay rational. The house was old, and old houses made strange noises. But then, one night, Kathy awoke to an overwhelming smell of decay, a fetid, putrid odor that made her stomach churn. She had grown used to the oddities of the house, but this was different. This was something more. She went downstairs to investigate. The kitchen was empty, the windows tightly shut, but the smell was suffocating. Her skin crawled as the scent seemed to follow her no matter where she went. She ran back upstairs, gasping for air, but the smell lingered, as if something foul was hiding in the very walls of the house. The children weren't spared from the house's eerie grip. Little Missy, the youngest of the Lutz children, began to talk to an imaginary friend named Jody. At first, Kathy thought nothing of it. Many children have imaginary friends. But Jody wasn't just any imaginary friend. Missy claimed Jody was a large, red-eyed pig, her face distorted and monstrous. Missy insisted that Jody was her friend, but Kathy couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of dread every time the child spoke about her. And then there was the cold. The cold never seemed to leave the house, especially at night. No matter how high they turned up the heat or how many blankets they piled on, a bone-deep chill settled into the walls, leaving them feeling vulnerable, exposed. The nights were the worst. It was as though something was watching them, waiting for the moment when they would finally succumb to the terror that had begun to haunt their every waking hour. But it wasn't just the house that was tormenting them. There was something far darker at play, something far more malevolent. George began to change. At first, it was subtle, a bad mood here, a sudden burst of anger there. But it quickly escalated. He found himself waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding in his chest. His mind would race with thoughts that weren't his own. Thoughts of violence, of hatred. He would hear voices, whispers that would grow louder and louder until they filled his head completely. At times, he would find himself drawn to the basement, as if something were calling him there. He tried to resist, but his body moved against his will, dragging him toward the dark, musty room as though it had some kind of hold over him. The darkness down there seemed alive, pulsating with an evil energy that twisted and contorted in the corners of his mind. Kathy, too, was affected. She started having vivid, disturbing dreams, nightmares that felt so real. She would wake up gasping for breath, her heart racing. In these dreams, she would see shadowy figures creeping through the house, whispering her name, their cold, skeletal hands reaching out for her. She would feel the weight of their presence even after she awoke, a feeling of being constantly watched. But it wasn't just the dreams. Kathy began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread that clung to her like a second skin. She would feel a presence in the room with her, something invisible but palpable, something that watched her every move, followed her wherever she went. The family grew increasingly paranoid. It seemed as though every time they turned around, something new had gone wrong. Objects were moved, lights flickered, and doors that were locked during the day were found wide open at night. And the air, the heavy, oppressive air, never seemed to lift. Even when they tried to leave the house, it followed them, a shadow that refused to be shaken. It was one night in particular that would break the family completely. George, exhausted from the constant strain of living in the house, awoke in the dead of night, feeling the familiar sensation of something pulling at his consciousness. The whispers had grown louder, the voices more insistent. He felt an overwhelming urge to go to the basement. Despite his better judgment, he got out of bed, staggering toward the stairs. His heart was pounding in his chest as he descended into the darkness below. He reached for the light switch, but it flickered and died before he could touch it. He was plunged into complete darkness, the air growing colder with each passing second. His breath came out in short, ragged gasps, and his hands shook as they searched for something, anything, to ground him in reality. Suddenly, he felt it, a hand on his shoulder. A cold, clammy hand. He whipped around, but there was no one there. The basement was empty. Yet, the sensation of being touched remained. He stumbled back, his heart racing, his mind a whirl of confusion and fear. The temperature plummeted, and his breath came out in visible puffs of mist. He tried to move, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor, trapped by an invisible force. And then a voice. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a roar, an animalistic growl that shook the very foundations of the house. The voice, deep and guttural, was filled with malice and hatred. It seemed to come from all directions, a sound so terrifying that it paralyzed him in place. "You belong to me now." The words echoed in his head, and the room seemed to close in around him. He could feel the walls pressing against him, suffocating him, as though the house itself was alive, breathing, feeding off his fear. George tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the void, swallowed by the house. The shadows around him thickened, swirling like a storm. He could hear footsteps, heavy, slow, deliberate, coming toward him, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that they weren't human. They were something worse. He fled, racing up the stairs, his heart hammering in his chest. But when he reached the top, he was faced with another terror. Kathy was standing in the hallway, her eyes wide and empty, as if she were not fully there. "George," she whispered, her voice cracked and hollow. "It's too late. We have to leave." And they did. They fled the house that night, not stopping until they were far away, as if the very act of leaving could erase the terror that had gripped their lives for so long. But even then, the memories of the house never left them. The Lutz family never returned to 112 Ocean Avenue, but their story became infamous. The house, still standing to this day, is a monument to fear, a reminder of the horrors that once lurked within its walls. And though many have come and gone, few have dared to stay for long. The Amityville Horror wasn't just a series of strange events. It was a story of a family that had come face to face with something far more terrifying than they could ever have imagined. Something that waits in the darkness, biding its time, ready to consume anyone who dares to enter. And once it has you, it never lets go. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, reimagined for horror and suspense. The wind howled through the trees of Sleepy Hollow that evening, carrying with it a chill that seemed to burrow deep into the bones of those who dared to wander too far into the woods after nightfall. The air, thick with fog, clung to the ground, making the path ahead indistinct, as though it were leading to some place beyond the veil of the living. The village of Sleepy Hollow lay nestled by the western shore of the Tappan Zee River, a secluded hamlet where the mundane and the supernatural were bound by an unspoken truce. The people here spoke in hushed tones, their eyes nervously scanning the shadows that seemed to grow longer each day. They knew better than to ask about the horsemen. the pale figure on a ghostly steed that appeared with terrifying regularity at dusk. Some said he was a mere tale, but others swore they had seen him in the fading light, his decapitated head clutched in his hand. It was in this eerie setting that the schoolteacher, Ichabod Crane, arrived one autumn evening, tall, gaunt, and awkward, his eyes as wide as the rumors about him. He had heard of the village's mysteries, of its spectral figures, and of its strange allure. With dreams of securing the hand of the beautiful Katrina Van Tassel, the daughter of a wealthy farmer, Ichabod had decided to settle there. Little did he know that the village's dark past was not so easily ignored, nor was its most infamous inhabitant so willing to let him waltz into its shadow. The villagers whispered about Ichabod's strange presence, his odd behavior, and his uncanny ability to make others uncomfortable. He would enter the tavern, his sharp, bony fingers tapping nervously on the edges of his mug, his sharp eyes darting from one face to the next. But it was his obsession with Katrina that had drawn the attention of the one person no one dared to challenge, Brom Bones. Brom Van Brunt was the local hero, strong and broad-shouldered, with a wild spirit that was both admired and feared. His rivalry with Ichabod was immediate, an animosity that brewed under the surface, manifesting in subtle pranks and cruel jokes. But Ichabod, blind to the dangers, could only focus on his affection for Katrina. On a cold night, with a full moon hanging like a silver coin in the sky, Ichabod rode home from the Van Tassel estate after an evening filled with music, food, and stories. He was far too deep in thought to notice the atmosphere shifting around him, the air growing heavier, the woods more oppressive. It was as though the very earth beneath his horse's hooves had turned to stone, whispering forgotten secrets. As he passed the darkened edges of the forest, a shadow flickered at the corner of his eye. His horse shied, but Ichabod, eager to return to his humble schoolhouse, urged it forward. The path he rode upon was narrow, winding through towering trees that seemed to lean inward, their twisted limbs reaching out like fingers, scraping against the sky. The further he went, the more he felt the oppressive weight of the forest surrounding him. It wasn't just the trees or the cold wind that unsettled him. There was something else, something unseen but profoundly felt. His heart raced as he approached the spot known as the Hollow. The villagers spoke of this place with a kind of fearful reverence, telling stories of ghostly figures and the sounds of muffled footsteps echoing in the night. Some claimed they had seen the ghostly rider there, his pale face twisted in eternal agony, his headless body searching for its lost skull. Ichabod had always laughed off these tales, dismissing them as superstition. But now, as the darkness thickened, he began to feel the sharp edge of fear pressing into his chest. It was then that he heard the soft thud of hooves in the distance. At first, he thought it was merely his imagination, his mind playing tricks on him in the dead of night. But as the sound grew louder, more distinct, he could no longer deny it. Someone or something was following him. Ichabod urged his horse into a gallop, the animal's hooves pounding against the earth in a frantic rhythm. He dared not look back, but the feeling of being pursued grew overwhelming, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He could hear the galloping growing louder still, the sound relentless, unyielding, as though the rider was closing in on him. He dared a glance over his shoulder. For a moment, there was nothing, just the empty road winding behind him, the forest pressing in like the jaws of some terrible beast. But then he saw it, a figure on horseback, as white as bone, its form a shifting shadow, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The rider was cloaked in darkness, its shape indistinct, save for one horrifying detail: the severed head, held high in the rider's hand, dripping a crimson fluid onto the ground below. Ichabod's heart thudded in his chest as panic seized him. The legend of the Headless Horseman, the very specter that haunted the village for generations, had come to life before his very eyes. The creature was gaining on him, its steed moving with a speed that defied logic, its dark presence bearing down on him with terrifying inevitability. Ichabod's pulse pounded in his ears as he urged his horse faster, but the shadowy figure was too swift, too relentless. The wind seemed to howl in his ears, deafening him to everything but the sound of hooves and the approaching terror. He could feel the rider's presence behind him, could almost hear the rasping breath of the phantom's horse as it drew near. Desperation flooded his veins as he raced down the path, seeking any escape, any refuge. The woods seemed to close in around him, the trees casting long, twisted shadows that made it impossible to tell where the path ended and the abyss began. And then, as if some malevolent force had willed it, the road before him disappeared into darkness. His horse reared up in fright, throwing Ichabod from his saddle and onto the cold, unforgiving ground. He scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged, his heart thundering in his chest. But there was no time to recover. The figure was upon him, its presence like a weight pressing down on his very soul. The smell of decay and death filled the air, a rancid stench that made his stomach churn. The rider leaned down from the horse, its glowing eyes locking with Ichabod's in a moment of frozen terror. Then, with a flick of its hand, the decapitated head was hurled through the air. It sailed toward Ichabod with terrifying precision, its eyes wide and empty, its mouth frozen in a scream. Ichabod screamed in agony, his body convulsing as the head struck him, and the world seemed to collapse in on itself. The last thing he saw was the ghastly grin on the rider's face, the smirk of someone who had seen too many souls lost in the dark. The next morning, the villagers found Ichabod's horse, trembling and foaming at the mouth, tied to a tree near the edge of the forest. But there was no sign of Ichabod. The only trace left behind was a single, broken pumpkin, its smashed remains littered across the ground. Its flesh dark and rotten. The tale of Ichabod Crane faded from the village's memory, becoming just another story whispered around the fireside. But those who lived in Sleepy Hollow knew better than to forget the truth that on some nights, when the wind howls through the trees and the moon hangs high in the sky, the headless horseman still rides. His quest for his lost head never ends, and his hunt for souls to claim is far from finished. And for those who venture too far into the hollow, there is a price to pay, a price far steeper than any mortal can bear. This version heightens the suspense and terror, adding to the sense of inevitability and doom that looms over Ichabod Crane and the village of Sleepy Hollow. The Dyatlov Pass Incident, a tale of mystery and terror. The wind screamed through the dark, snow-covered expanse of the Ural Mountains, a constant, biting force that threatened to tear apart all that stood in its path. There was no sign of life in the vast, inhospitable wilderness, just an endless stretch of white, broken only by jagged peaks, cold and indifferent. The silence was thick, oppressive, as if nature itself had sealed off the land from the rest of the world, guarding its secrets from the eyes of men. It was February 1959, and a group of 9 experienced hikers, led by the resolute Igor Dyatlov, had set out on what was supposed to be a straightforward journey to the summit of Otorten, a peak deep in the Russian Urals. They were young, confident, and seasoned mountaineers. None of them knew that they would soon be at the mercy of forces far beyond their understanding, forces that would leave them broken, their fates a mystery that would haunt the world for decades to come. The hikers had arrived at the Dyatlov Pass, their final destination, on the evening of February 1st. Their goal was simple: make camp, rest, and then summit the mountain the next day. The weather had been harsh, but not unusual for the region. Yet on the night of February 2nd, something went terribly wrong. At 5 p.m., the last message from the group was sent, a brief telegram announcing their arrival at the pass and their intention to move on the next day. That was the last anyone heard from them. The hours stretched on, and still there was no word, no signs of their camp, no indication that they had moved as planned. The next day came and went, but no hikers returned from the mountains. Worried relatives and colleagues eventually raised the alarm, and a search party was dispatched on February 20th. They found the hikers' tent at the foot of the mountain, standing eerily in the snow, its entrance slashed open from the inside. The flaps of the tent were torn apart, as though the hikers had cut their way out in a desperate, frantic rush. Their belongings were left behind: coats, shoes, food, even cameras, untouched, abandoned in the frozen wasteland. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no bodies, just the empty tent, frozen in time, as though the hikers had simply vanished into thin air. But the mystery was just beginning. As the search party combed through the snow, they found the first body, hundreds of meters away from the tent. It was the body of Yuri Doroshenko, one of the hikers. His frozen form lay stark against the white snow, arms outstretched, his face contorted into an expression of terror. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, locked in a horrified stare that suggested he had seen something unspeakable, something that had torn the very soul from him. His body was strange, too. Parts of his skin were singed, as though subjected to an intense, unexplained heat. But there was no sign of fire, no source of this unnatural warmth. It was as though some invisible force had burned him, but left him untouched by flames. Nearby, the body of Georgy Krivonischenko was found. He too showed signs of injury that were difficult to explain. His hands were badly blistered, as though he had been gripping something hot, and his clothes were tattered. But his body, like the others, seemed untouched by any external threat. He too was frozen, his life stolen by the cold, his final moments an absolute mystery. More bodies were discovered in the following days, each one adding to the horror of what was happening. They were found scattered across the mountainside, some partially clothed, others missing clothing that was clearly taken from other members of the group. Some had no shoes, no coats, barefoot in the freezing cold. It was as though they had been in such a panic that they stripped off their clothing in desperation. And yet, none of them had shown any signs of a struggle, no footprints in the snow, no indication of what had driven them to flee from their camp. The most unsettling discovery came with the body of Igor Dyatlov. He was found further away from the rest, buried partially in snow. His body had been crushed, his skull fractured, his chest caved in, as though he had been struck by some massive, unseen force. The trauma was so severe that it seemed impossible for a human being to survive it. And yet, there were no weapons around, no evidence of any fight, no blood staining the snow. The group had been physically attacked, but by what? As the investigation deepened, other details emerged, each one adding to the growing web of questions that surrounded the hikers' deaths. Some of the bodies had sustained injuries consistent with blunt force trauma, broken bones, fractured skulls, but there were no signs of violence, no weapons, no struggle. One of the most chilling details was that the hikers' bodies had been found in various states of disarray. Some were missing their eyes. Others had their tongues ripped out. Some had their faces mutilated, as if something or someone had torn them apart in a frenzy. But the strangest part was that the bodies showed no external signs of bleeding. The injuries appeared to be internal, as though they had been inflicted by a force so powerful it could not be explained by human means. As the investigators delved deeper into the mystery, they uncovered even more disturbing details. The hikers' clothes showed traces of radiation. Their skin was strangely discolored, and some of their clothing had been burned. But the most disturbing discovery was that none of the injuries matched what would be expected from natural causes, like an avalanche or an animal attack. Theories began to swirl wild, impossible theories. Some suggested that the hikers had been exposed to a military weapon, some kind of secret Soviet experiment gone horribly wrong. Others speculated that they had encountered a terrifying creature in the mountains, something from the ancient legends of the Urals, something that had stalked them, killed them, and left their bodies to rot in the snow. But perhaps the most chilling theory of all was that the hikers had encountered something far beyond human comprehension. Something not of this world. Something that had been waiting in the cold, silent night of the mountains for centuries, biding its time. Had they unknowingly stumbled upon a curse? Had they provoked something ancient and malevolent? Something that had claimed their lives and left their bodies as evidence of its dark power? The more the investigators uncovered, the more it seemed that there was no logical explanation for what had happened. No clear answers. No resolution. Just the bodies, broken, mangled, and unexplained. The Dyatlov Pass incident became a mystery that no one could solve, a nightmare that refused to fade from the minds of those who sought the truth. And so, the winds still howl through the snow-covered expanse of the Ural Mountains, carrying with them the echoes of the 9 hikers who perished there. The pass remains as silent and foreboding as ever, its secrets buried deep within the frozen ground, waiting for those who dare to uncover them. For in the heart of those mountains, something waits, something that has claimed lives before and will undoubtedly do so again. And until the mystery is solved, the Dyatlov Pass will remain one of the darkest corners of the earth, a place where terror reigns and the truth lies hidden beneath layers of snow and time. The Dyatlov Pass Incident, a tale of terror. It was late January of 1959 when the group, led by Igor Dyatlov, set off from the town of Sverdlovsk, now Ekaterinburg, armed with nothing but their courage backpacks and skis. They were experienced hikers, seasoned by previous treks across the Soviet Union. This was supposed to be just another journey, an adventure in the frozen wilderness. The days grew shorter as they traveled, the sun barely rising above the horizon, casting long shadows and painting the snow in hues of orange and pink. As they trekked deeper into the mountains, a strange sense of unease crept into their minds. It was subtle at first, an inexplicable feeling that something was wrong. Perhaps it was the eerie silence that surrounded them, the unnatural stillness of the trees, or the way the wind howled in a language they couldn't understand. There were no signs of wildlife, no birds, no tracks of animals, nothing to break the stillness. The group made camp at the base of the mountain, at a spot they later called the Dyatlov Pass. It was here that the atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. The members of the group did not speak of it, but each one of them could feel it, a presence, something watching, something waiting. By the time the night fell, the temperature had plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire they built crackled in the night, but it offered little comfort against the oppressive cold. They huddled together, their breath visible in the dim light, and as they tried to sleep, the sound of the wind outside grew more unsettling. It was no longer a howl, but a wail, a mournful cry that seemed to echo through the very bones of the earth. The group awoke suddenly in the middle of the night, disturbed by an eerie sound. It was a low, guttural rumbling, as if the mountains themselves were speaking. The ground beneath them trembled, and for a moment, the very air felt alive, charged, as though something was about to happen. Igor Dyatlov, ever the leader, rose to his feet, signaling to the others. They had heard rumors of avalanches in the area, but nothing could have prepared them for the terror that was about to unfold. They hurriedly packed their belongings, their hearts pounding in their chests. Panic set in, but there was no clear explanation for why they should be afraid. No visible threat, no obvious danger, but the primal instinct that something was wrong urged them to leave. They gathered their things, but the fear kept them frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. There was a sense of urgency, but no reason for it. In their haste, they left their tents, still standing against the night. The wind howled louder, like a chorus of whispers from 1,000 unseen voices. They moved toward the trees, their skis crunching through the snow, but the night seemed to stretch on forever. There was no escaping the suffocating feeling that clung to them like a shadow. Then, one by one, they began to disappear. The first to fall was Yuri Krivonischenko, a young man with wide eyes that had always sparkled with curiosity. He stumbled as though something unseen had struck him from behind. His body crumpled to the snow, and before anyone could react, a shadow seemed to rise above him, darker than the night itself. It hovered over him for a moment, and then, as if beckoned by some otherworldly force, the figure vanished. The others were frozen, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into hours. The group moved silently through the snow, their hearts beating faster, their breaths shallow and panicked. The trees loomed over them, their bare branches like skeletal hands reaching out from the darkness. It was as if the forest itself was closing in, trapping them in its icy embrace. But the horror didn't stop there. A sharp scream cut through the air, echoing off the mountainside. Zinaida Kolmogorova, the strong and composed member of the group, collapsed to the ground, her face twisted in terror. Her hands clawed at the snow as though she were trying to push something away, something invisible, something sinister. Her scream was the last sound she made before her body went limp, her eyes wide open, staring into the void. The others, too, were overtaken by the same madness. Panic turned to terror, and terror turned to chaos. Ludmila Dubinina, the youngest of the group, her face filled with confusion, took off into the wilderness, running without direction, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She collapsed not far from the camp, but not before she had caught a glimpse of something that no human was meant to see: an immense, shadowy figure moving through the trees, its form barely perceptible, but its presence undeniable. It was the last thing she ever saw. The remaining members of the group, including Igor Dyatlov, were left to face the horror of the unknown. But no one was spared. Their bodies were found scattered across the mountainside, as though they had been torn apart by an unseen force. Some of the hikers were found with their eyes gouged out, others with their tongues missing, and one had a skull crushed with such force it seemed as though the very earth had turned against them. In the aftermath, search parties scoured the mountains for days. When they finally found the camp, they could make no sense of what had happened. The tents had been slashed open from the inside, as though the hikers had been trying to escape something. Their clothing was found in piles, discarded in haste, and their bodies lay in positions that suggested they had been dragged into the snow, only to be abandoned by whatever dark force had claimed them. The mystery of what happened to Igor Dyatlov and his group has never been fully solved. Some theories suggest an avalanche, but no signs of one were found. Others claim it was a military experiment gone wrong, a weapon of unimaginable power unleashed upon the unsuspecting hikers. Still others point to a more supernatural explanation, something older than the mountains themselves, a force that had waited for the right moment to strike. But in the cold of the Ural Mountains, where the wind still howls and the trees creak under the weight of ancient secrets, one thing is certain. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains a story that refuses to be told. The mountain has swallowed their tale, and it will never give it back. The shadows of the dead linger there, waiting for anyone foolish enough to seek the truth. And for those who venture into that cursed place, there is no escape. The wind, the trees, and the darkness itself will claim them, just as it claimed the 9 who dared to challenge it so long ago.